The first time Robin Roberts learned the sound of silence, it wasn't in a hospital room or a quiet prayer. It was in the dark, hours before sunrise, when the studio lights were still off and the city outside was still asleep. She sat alone in the dressing room at ABC, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful, only heavy, like a blanket pulled too tight. The mirror reflected a woman who had spent decades practicing the art of calm, but the face looking back at her was not the one the public knew. It was tired. It was raw. It was the face of someone who had learned to carry other people's mornings while quietly surviving her own nights. In that moment, she was America's anchor. She was simply a person, waiting for the day to begin and wondering how many more days she could keep doing this. 2. Robin's morning ritual was never meant to be performance. It began with a simple act, a short message recorded for viewers who might be starting their day with a quiet, private need for comfort. Over time, those messages became something else, tiny lifelines, a morning anchor for people who didn't know how to explain what they were feeling. She never planned for them to become a signature. She never planned for them to be saved, replayed, or shared. But the truth is, she always understood the power of words. Even before she became the face of a national morning show, she knew that a sentence spoken gently at the right time could change the shape of a day. She just never imagined she'd one day need those same words to steady herself. The world sees Robin Roberts as a steady presence, but the truth is she has never been steady in the way people think. Her life has always been a series of tremors, moments when the ground shifts and you have to decide whether to fall or keep moving. There were early years when she was fighting for a chance to be heard, when doors closed not because of her talent, but because of the color of her skin. She learned early that the world did not always reward strength. Sometimes it punished it. Sometimes it ignored it. But she kept going anyway, because she had a kind of stubborn faith that didn't ask permission to exist. Then came the moment that changed everything, when she found herself in a hospital room, staring at a diagnosis that had the power to erase her future. It wasn't a dramatic scene, not in the way people imagine. It was ordinary, almost mundane, which made it worse. A doctor's words, a pause, the kind of silence that makes your body feel like it belongs to someone else. The word cancer didn't hit like a thunderbolt. It landed like a slow, spreading shadow. She remembered thinking, not why me. But what now? Because she had never been the type to ask for pity. She was the type who got up and kept going, but this was different. This wasn't about strength. It was about survival. The first time her hair fell out, she didn't cry immediately. She stood in front of the mirror and watched it happen like a scientist observing a phenomenon. She felt disconnected from herself, like she was watching her own body betray her. It was not the physical loss that broke her. It was the symbolism of it. Hair is a private kind of identity, a thing you can control. When it disappears, you feel like you've lost your ability to choose. That's when the grief began, not just for the life she might lose, but for the version of herself that was slipping away. She had always been a woman who used her appearance as a kind of armor, a way to show the world that she was capable, confident, unbreakable. Suddenly, the armor was gone. And yet she continued. She went through chemotherapy, radiation, surgeries, every kind of medical violence the body can endure. She did it publicly, because her life had become public, and because she believed that hiding would only strengthen the stigma of illness. But it wasn't easy. There were moments when she felt like a stranger in her own skin. She would look at her reflection and wonder if the person staring back at her still belonged to the same life. She would feel the exhaustion in her bones and realize that strength has a limit. That's the thing people don't talk about. Strength is not a constant. It fluctuates. It runs out. It needs rest. And yet, she kept showing up. In April, she made a decision that felt like both surrender and rebellion. She removed her wig on live television. She did it not to create a moment, but to reclaim control. The cameras didn't make her do it. She chose it. She chose to show her face to the world without the shield she had used for so long. It was not a glamorous act. It was not a heroic one in the way people often describe heroism. It was simply human. It was a woman saying, "This is who I am, even when I'm falling apart." And for millions of viewers, it was a moment of permission to be vulnerable, to be seen, to be real. But survival didn't end there. After the world breathed a sigh of relief, thinking she had conquered the worst, a new diagnosis arrived like a cruel echo of the past. Myelodysplastic syndrome, MDS, rare, dangerous, and often a result of previous cancer treatment. This time, the doctors were blunt. Without a bone marrow transplant, she had a year or two to live. There was no room for optimism to be enough. There was no time for faith to simply carry her through. This was a race against a clock she couldn't slow down. The search for a donor became a private kind of public crisis. She had to put her life in the hands of strangers, people she would never meet, people who might never even know they saved her. She had to accept that her survival depended on a system that is often indifferent. She watched the numbers, the registries, the probability, and felt a kind of helplessness she had never known. She was the woman who had spent decades telling others to keep going. Now she was the one waiting for someone to say yes to her existence. And then, against all odds, her sister became the answer. Sally Ann was a perfect match. It was the kind of miracle that sounds like a movie plot, but in real life it doesn't feel like magic. It feels like fear and love and a weight you can't describe. Sally Ann didn't hesitate. She didn't ask what it would cost her. She simply agreed to give a part of herself to save her sister. That's the kind of love that doesn't need explanation. It's the kind that makes you believe in something bigger than pain. But even a miracle comes with its own scars. Sally Ann was preparing to give Robin a chance to live, while the family was also preparing for a different kind of loss. Their mother was gravely ill. Luca Marion Roberts was dying in Mississippi, and the timing was a cruel twist that no one could prepare for. Robin found herself trapped in a paradox. She was fighting to stay alive while also watching the woman who gave her life slip away. The emotional collision was unbearable. She was standing in two realities at once, and both of them demanded everything she had. The roads to Mississippi were flooded from a storm, and the journey became a symbol of the family's struggle. Everything was against them. It wasn't just a physical obstacle. It was a metaphor for the way life had been behaving lately, unkind, unpredictable, relentless. Robin drove through rain and debris, not as a television anchor, but as a daughter racing against time. When she reached her mother's bedside, she held her hand as if holding on to the last piece of a life that was slipping away. The moment her mother died, something inside Robin broke. It wasn't just grief. It was a collapse of the world she thought she understood. The day her mother died was also the day her survival became uncertain. She was waiting for the transplant, waiting for a chance to live, waiting for a future that suddenly felt less guaranteed. She was also grieving the person who had been her emotional anchor, the one who had always made her feel safe. She later described the experience as a cruel paradox, one life hanging by a thread, another slipping away. It was a kind of suffering that doesn't fit into any narrative. It doesn't have a moral. It doesn't have a lesson. It just exists and it changes you. In the midst of this, the world continued to watch. The morning show continued. The ratings continued. The headlines continued. People still wanted their reassurance, their calm, their voice of reason. But Robin was no longer just the voice. She was a woman who had been forced to become intimate with death. She had learned the shape of grief in a way that no one wants to learn. She had learned that survival does not erase sorrow. It simply changes its form. She carried her grief with her like a secret. She carried it into the studio, into interviews, into her smile. The transplant itself was brutal. It required chemotherapy that wiped out her immune system. It required days of isolation, where the world became a distant memory. She described feeling like she was in another place, detached, floating, trapped inside a body that didn't feel like hers. There were moments when she couldn't remember what day it was, or who she was before all of this began. The medical process was so intense that it didn't leave room for emotion. It left room only for survival. She had to surrender control in a way she never had before. Then came the return to Good Morning America. She stepped back into the studio after 174 days. The number itself became symbolic, a way to measure time in a world where time had been taken away. She said those words, the ones that felt like a triumph not because they were dramatic, but because they were real. She was back. For viewers, it was a victory. For Robin, it was proof that she had been given more time. Time she didn't take for granted. Time she knew was fragile. Time that had already cost her so much. But the public victory did not erase the private pain. Her life had changed, and not in a way that could be healed by applause. She had survived, but she had also been forced to watch the people she loved suffer. Her partner, Amber Lane, later faced her own battle with breast cancer. Robin had already endured the fear and pain of her own diagnosis, but watching Amber go through it was different. It felt like being helpless in a way she never had to be before. She cried more during Amber's treatment than she ever cried during her own. She had always been the one who carried others. Now she had to watch someone else carry pain, and she couldn't carry it for them. Their relationship deepened in ways that cannot be explained by romance alone. It became a partnership built on shared vulnerability. They learned to exist in uncertainty together, to hold each other without trying to fix everything. They learned that love is not only about joy. It is also about showing up when the world feels like it is trying to break you. When they eventually married, it was not a fairy tale ending. It was a quiet acknowledgement that they had survived together. It was a vow made in the shadow of trauma, a promise that they would keep living even when life felt unbearable. But the world outside their love continued to be complicated. Robin's professional life was not immune to pain. Even after surviving cancer, even after becoming one of the most trusted faces in America, she found herself facing a different kind of battle, one that had nothing to do with health and everything to do with dignity. Reports emerged that a senior executive had made racially insensitive remarks connected to her salary. The news was shocking not because it was unexpected. Robin had known how the world can be, but because it happened to someone who had already given so much. The investigation confirmed inappropriate language. The executive was dismissed, but the damage had already been done. The truth is, she had been navigating a world that still didn't fully accept her, even after she had become central to its identity. She had always known that race shaped perception in ways talent alone could not erase. She had experienced the subtle, painful realities of being seen as other, even while being celebrated. The incident wasn't just about a comment. It was about the reminder that respect is not always automatic. It must be demanded. It must be fought for. And even when you win, the victory can feel hollow. Then there was the internal tension within the GMA team itself. Allegations surfaced about a toxic work environment, and speculations swirled around the relationship between Robin and her co-anchor. The public wanted a scandal. The truth was far more human. Robin was not angry because of ego. She was angry because she cared. She cared about the people who worked alongside her. She cared about the integrity of the workplace. She cared about the idea that a place that should feel safe could become a place of harm. Her anger wasn't a performance. It was a protective instinct. It was the same instinct that had driven her to survive. What made her emotional message in October so powerful was not just the loss of Eric Pollson. It was the accumulation. It was the way grief had been following her for decades, like a shadow that never fully disappears. Eric was not just a colleague. He was part of the emotional geography of her family, a shared presence that had existed alongside her sister for years. He was a familiar voice in the morning, a trusted face, a man who had built a life in a city that loved him. When he died, it wasn't just a professional loss. It was a personal one. It was the kind of loss that reminds you that life is not fair, and that even when you survive, you are still vulnerable. The call from her sister came at the worst possible time. Robin was returning from a weekend in New Orleans with her wife and goddaughter, a moment that should have been a brief escape from the demands of her career. Instead, it became the moment she was forced to transition from private grief to public composure in a matter of minutes. She stepped onto the set with a tremor in her voice, a tremor that no one could ignore. She recorded her morning message, and the audience could feel the weight of it. She didn't try to hide her pain. She didn't try to perform strength. She simply let herself be human. When she spoke about Eric, her voice tightened. She paused. The pause was not a break in the script. It was a crack in the armor. It was a moment where the world saw that the woman who had spent her life reassuring others was also someone who could break. She spoke of her sister's devastation. She spoke of New Orleans mourning. She spoke of a city losing a familiar face. Then she did something rare. She dedicated her morning prayer to Eric. She offered a kiss to the sky. It was a gesture that felt like a private ritual made public, a reminder that grief does not always need a stage. Sometimes it just needs a witness. So the question remains, can one person carry this much loss and still show up every morning for others? The answer is both yes and no. Yes, because Robin Roberts has shown us the capacity of the human spirit to endure. She has shown us that survival is not a one-time event. It is a continuous act of courage. But also know, because the cost is real. She has carried grief like a secret companion for years, and sometimes that secret becomes too heavy to hold alone. That October morning wasn't just a moment of vulnerability. It was a reminder that the people who seem the strongest are often the ones who have been broken the most. And perhaps the real lesson is not whether she can carry it all, but that we, as a society, should stop expecting anyone to carry it alone. Because even the strongest voices deserve to be held.